Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us and taking part in our Yom HaShoah, or Holocaust Remembrance Day program, brought to you by the City of Mission Viejo and the Jewish Federation of Family Services of Orange County. I'm Council Member Ed Sachs, and I'm very proud to be with you today. Today, as many of you know, is National Day of Commemoration in Israel and communities around the world memorializing the over 6 million Jewish men, women, and children who were murdered in the Holocaust. Yom HaShoah, the anniversary of the start of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, also honors the people who survived that era of evil and the heroes who found the courage to resist Nazi oppression. During today's program, you will see 6 lit candles representing those 6 million people who perished in the Holocaust and the heroism of survivors and rescuers. Because of these unprecedented times with the COVID-19 virus, we bring you our program virtually while we practice social distancing, like I am with our guest here today. In just a few minutes, I will have the privilege of introducing to you 90-year-old Auschwitz survivor who was only 10 years old in 1939 when the Germans invaded Poland and occupied his hometown. He will talk about how he survived not one, but 2 concentration camps and his daring escape from the death march. And I hope we have time where he could tell you a little bit about his exchange with his father, an Orthodox Jew, about how he felt at the time. During this program, we invite you to submit questions for our special guest by emailing remembrance@cityofmissionviejo.org or by calling 949-470-8464. We hope to address as many questions as possible. So without further ado, please welcome Holocaust survivor Sam Silberberg. Sam, one of those heroes we talk about from the Holocaust era and one who escaped. Sam, thank you for joining us today. Can you take us back in time a little bit and begin to tell us your story?
Thank you very much. Well, I want to start the story by telling the people that they're dealing here with a 90-year-old man who knows that time is limited and had the benefit of looking back at the years to evaluate. In this time of the pandemic that we all live in, and it's all hyped up in the media. And I want to tell you, don't worry about it. It's not as bad as it sounds or it looks. And I just want to tell you some of my experiences so that you can compare it and take solace in the fact that you have the wherewithal to withstand the test of time. And I'm just going to tell you to begin with about how as I look back at my life, when you get to be my age, and God gave me the privilege to be fairly healthy at 90, you look back, what is your biggest accomplishment in life? I hope that you people can comprehend it in the spirit in which it was felt. And I can remember 2 things which are most outstanding. One of them was during the death march when the Nazis led 4,500 prisoners in the death march while the Allied forces were advancing to dig trenches for German defenses deep into Germany, and they marched us without food or anything, and all we had to do is survive by melting snow in the metal canisters that they gave us. And people were starving left and right like flies. As a matter of fact, of the 4,800 prisoners, only 800 survived and got to their destination. And I remember on the fourth day of that march, a German peasant, mind you, took pity on those poor souls and threw a bucket of rooted potatoes, which were as small as that, to the prisoners. And I was with my father in prison camp. And my father was a very great gentleman and delicate man, devoted to God and his religion, and he would not pounce on it, but most prisoners did. And I managed to get a small rooting potato like this, and I was starving. And I remember having hesitated whether or not I should share it with my father, because the animal instinct in the human being in those circumstances is so awful. But thank God that I had the wherewithal. And mind you, I was only 15 years old at the time, to share it with my father. As a matter of fact, while I was thankful that I had the wherewithal to share it with my father, I was also very, very disturbed about the fact that I even had thoughts of hesitation, because under normal circumstances, you would love to share it with your loved ones. So that's one aspect of it. The second aspect of my pride of accomplishment in life is, after 2,000 years of diaspora, where the Jews were exiled from the Holy Land, I had the chance to join the underground and going through circuitous routes to reach the Holy Land, and was able to participate in the war of liberation and establishment of the State of Israel. That was, look, during my subsequent life, I did all sorts of stuff. I made money and lost money. But in the bare essence, when it comes down to it, what's important in life is your spiritual and emotional satisfaction of accomplishing goals which supersede material needs. And that was one of them. Now I'm going to tell you exactly what happened since the age I was actually 9 years old. In November of 1938, my grandfather was having a bon voyage party because he was departing to the Holy Land, and we were all gathered at this celebration when I, as a kid, saw a bunch of young men gathered and having very serious discussions. And somehow, as a 9-year-old, I was nosing around to find out what it's all about, what they discussed. So an uncle of mine his name was Uncle Moses, noticed me being perturbed by and curious about what's transpired. So he told me, you know what they're discussing? They're discussing the German invasion of Sudetenland. And they're discussing Kristallnacht, which is a German word translated meaning the night of broken glass, when German goons attacked, destroyed, and killed many Jews, destroyed many synagogues, and so on. And the clouds of war were imminent, my uncle told me. And he just warned me. He said, look, Sam, if God forbid something happens and Germans invade Poland and there is a pogrom of that sort and your life is threatened, I want you to go to Palestine, to the Holy Land, where you will be able to establish your own identity without any persecution and discrimination, etc. And he gave me a lesson in geography, telling me, you know, you go through Austria, you go through all these other countries to Turkey, from Turkey to Syria, and from Syria to the Holy Land, etc. So that ignited me the spark of Zionism for the urge to establish a Jewish national home and state where Jews will no longer be persecuted. And that spark endured in me for the rest of my life. Well, in September 1, 1939, the Germans invaded Poland. And immediately upon their occupation, they took Jewish people hostages, so that in case something happens to a German soldier, they will get executed. As a matter of fact, in an adjacent town to ours, they executed 2 of my uncles. And right after that, they took my father hostage. The whole family was afraid as to what's going to happen to him, and we were very worried. And since the family consisted of about 108 people surrounding in local towns, surrounding towns, we had to call all our financial resources to bribe some German officials to release my father. So it took him a few days, and after he was released, he was unrecognizable. They cut his beard off, they shaved it off. He was obviously very changed person. It was awful what they did, but at least he was alive. And now our family had a lot of businesses, and the Germans immediately issued edicts where they confiscated all Jewish businesses, but since they did not have the personnel to supervise it, but they sent a German supervisor to supervise the business, and they collected all the earnings of the business, depriving my father and the family of a livelihood. It was tough, but soon enough, again, in our family, immediate family, we were 4 children. my brother was 4.5 years, my older brother was 4.5 years older than me. I had a younger sister about 18 months younger than me, and a younger brother about 4 years younger than me. And as the Germans immediately issued edicts to prohibit Jewish children from getting education, so the family was in a very, very bad situation because we couldn't have an income because they confiscated all the money that the business earned, and yet they prevented the children from having an education. And in Jewish tradition, an education of the children surmounts any other need. It's considered extremely important because what's happening, if you have an education and if you know in your head you have wisdom and knowledge, nobody can take it away from you. Money and material things can be taken away. That's why it is so important that kids get the proper education. So the Jewish community instituted in different homes to have education for kids of different grades, different levels. Now, the Germans were conducting intermittent raids to take the able-bodied men into the labor camps because Germany mobilized the entire youth, able-bodied men into the army with the idea of conquering not only Europe, but the whole world. I remember, as I just think about it, I remember when I was, as a kid, loving soldiers and so on. I used to play it, and I was watching as the Germans rode in to Poland as they marched, where they were singing Heute gehört uns Deutschland, morgen die ganze Welt, which means today we own Germany, tomorrow the entire world. Or Deutschland, Deutschland über alles in der Welt, which means Germany, Germany above everything else in the world. It was with that kind of chutzpah, they say in Yiddish, which is with that kind of gall, they went about occupying all of Europe. Now you can imagine, as a kid, 10 years old, being discriminated against, living under those circumstances, your older brother's taken into a labor camp. Now, because of those stern edicts forbidding education, it was my job to take my youngest sister and brother to their respectful schooling homes of neighbors, etc. Now, the only thing about that kind of adventure is that we had to be worried because the Nazis kept conducting intermittent raids to gather able-bodied young men, Jewish men, to go into labor camps because they needed to replace the labor force which they mobilized into the armed forces. And lo and behold, this was, and while they conducted those raids, they also took the older people, the feeble people, women and babies, and took them into extermination camps. So I was responsible to take my siblings to their respective schooling things and watch out to make sure that they are not caught by the Nazis. That, in doing so, I developed a keen sensitivity to my surroundings and what's going on, an ability to hide and protect my siblings. But this didn't last long. After a while, as this was going on, since the town I was in was only about 18 miles out of Auschwitz, things got worse continually. And it was Auschwitz that was, before the war, a Polish officers' camp for Polish soldiers. The Germans converted into an extermination camp. And as they occupied the rest of Europe, they kept building a special railroad track to the extermination camp of Auschwitz, where they brought in people from all Europe, Jews from all European countries to that extermination camp. Auschwitz and Birkenau. Birkenau was a mile and a half away from Auschwitz. And the trains would come in to Birkenau, where they were segregated. People were segregated. And the able-bodied men were taken to work again, while women, children, and the older people were exterminated. Now the Nazi regime was so intent on eliminating and exterminating the Jewish people that in January of 1942, in the town of Wannsee, which is outside of Berlin, the Nazi hierarchy gathered and decided upon a plan of extermination which was unequal with the most brutal and human existence of the Jewish people. And Eichmann and the entire brass of the German government was participating in it. And they called it a solution for the Jewish problem. Anti-Semitism and hatred was so frequently exclaimed and propagated by the German leadership that in hatred was propagated constantly against the Jewish people, and that showed itself once they decided to do it. Now, the methods of extermination was fairly primitive and simple in the beginning. they would have prisoners build trenches and then shoot them over the trench, so the bodies fall into the trenches and so on. They would take prisoners, put them onto trucks, and take a pipe and tie to exhaust pipe of the trunk to the exhaust system of the trunk and gas them this way. But the German genius and hatred was so great that they developed Cyclone B12, which was a poison gas, where they would take people by the train load, send them to Auschwitz, and tell them they're going into a bath where they could cleanse themselves and take a shower. And once they were in the shower, over the roof of the shower was the tank of Cyclone B12, and they were gassed and then taken into crematorium. The trains going to the Auschwitz extermination camp were so steady that I remember then we were still in our town, that they couldn't kill him fast enough, so they had to sidetrack him. I remember my mother got word that in our town was a sidetracked train destined to Auschwitz with all those unfortunate people. Now, I was 11 and a half years old at the time by then, and asked me, would you I give you 2 bags of food and for them, and see if you can go down to the railroad station and throw it to them. And I want to tell you, when I went down there and I saw those people that were in those cattle cars going to the extermination camp of Auschwitz with their hands stretching out, and as I approached it, there was a whole area of bushes, and I tried, I was only then 11 and a half years old, so my aim wasn't at the beginning that good, and then I was afraid because the German sentries over there would catch me and take me in with them, but I managed to crawl in the bushes closer to the train and finally got pretty good aim. So when I got home, my mother asked me, how did you do? So I wouldn't tell her about the German sentries and all this, because as a kid, I got a kick out of doing it, because I felt I'm doing something good for those miserable people that are suffering, that misery, no toilet facilities, nothing. I could even smell the stench of their excrement. It was awful feeling, but I did it. Came back, I did it one more time, and so on. Before you know it, the Germans started to liquidate the town, because the Germans conducted intermittent raids. And they found that if the Jews are spread out in different towns, it is inefficient for them to catch as many Jews at once. So they decided to concentrate them into a ghetto. So by the end of 1942, we were sent into a ghetto which was called Schroedula, in a town of Auschwitz. Yet they had my father come back to the town of Viejo to run the business for them, and so on, and we had no means of surviving or making any money. And in the ghetto, conditions were awful. The Germans were smart enough to run the ghettos by with a Jewish, a Judenrat, they call it, which is a Jewish municipality run by Jews, but the Jews that ran it were subservient to the German orders and were executing the German orders because they thought that's one way they can survive. Conditions in the ghetto were awful. Food was rationed. Everything was in short supply. And when everything is in short supply, you guys know with the pandemic how bad it was, how people panicked to get groceries. Can you imagine a time of war where everything is rationed? How that was. It was awful. And people were starving actually from hunger. And what happens in time like this, there's price gouging, and the Judenrat, which is the people that ran it, prohibited citizens from going outside because it was fenced in. You had to have a special permit. And if you want to get a special permit, you would have to pay payola, a substantial amount of money, which we didn't have. Now, we needed to survive. And since in the ghetto, we were located in an apartment on the ground basement floor, which was on a hill overlooking the surrounding area. He told me, you know what, we will open an opening in the fence which is covered by bushes, and he told me, you will go out. Now remember, my older brother at that time was in a labor camp. My younger brother and my sister and I and my father were in this with other members of the family, different related family, etc. And all of us were in a condition where we were starving. So we were forced. You know, necessity is the mother of invention. And when you starve, you got to do something. So my father said to me, listen, Sam, you're going to go out. You're going to smuggle your way outside of the ghetto. And what you're going to do is this. You will buy goods, because in the Jewish community there were craftsmen which were able to do all sorts of stuff. They were making shoes. There were shoemakers making shoes. They were manufacturing shoes, suits, and so on. The agrarian Polish community outside of the ghetto didn't have a source of supply of that sort. So what you do is take some manufactured clothing and shoes that you purchase in the ghetto and sell it outside to the agrarian community, with which you can buy food products and so on, bringing into the ghetto. I had no idea how to do it. She told me it's simple. Look, you buy a pair of shoes for $10, you sell it for $12. You buy a suit for $15, you sell it for $20, and so on. And the same thing you do with the groceries you buy outside, and so on. The smuggling wasn't easy because, number one, Jews were prohibited from using public transportation. So for me, in order to go with streetcar, I had to be afraid that some Pole will just send me and expose me to some German policeman, and I'd be taken into prison. So that was a very problematic thing for me to do. But I managed to do it. Everything was fine, but I had to be afraid. As a matter of fact, one time when I came back with the food supplies and approached the ghetto fence, again, at that time my father and mother could see me because I was coming up the hill and they were on top of the hill, and they could see me, and a German policeman screamed immediately, "Stop!" And I knew right away if he catches me, he's going to do something. And besides, I didn't mind in taking my supplies, but I was afraid. So luckily I was smart enough, because in the stuff that I brought back was a bottle of booze, and I was smart enough to take out the bottle of booze and drop it on the floor, which attracted his attention. He was busy looking and picking up the bottle. I managed to get into the ghetto. The conditions in the ghetto were so bad. My sister was ill because she had gangrene in her leg. They took her to the hospital, and she was in a hospital, and they were going to amputate her leg. And as a matter of fact, I remember my father got me and my younger brother together to promise that God, if we survive this and all this, that we will take care of our sister. You can imagine. You get this at the age of 12 and a half.
Sam, I have to ask you, we're running out of a little bit of time, and I hate to interrupt you. Can you tell us a little bit about when you were captured and when you escaped, your experience in the camps and your escape?
The Nazis liquidated the ghetto. They surrounded the ghetto and asked 35,000 people to assemble in a huge lot where they made selections. When they made it, and it was a roped-off sections, they ordered everyone to report. And as we were reporting, at that time my sister was in the hospital. We knew she's going to be taken to Auschwitz and won't make it. So my father said, you know what? My father and mother decided I go with my father, my younger brother goes with my mother. So we went, and as we saw the roped off sections and everything else, I said to my father, you know what? I don't want to be a handicap to you, because you are able-bodied. You probably would go with the able-bodied men. I know I'll be subjected to go to the extermination camp, etc., and I'll see if I can make my way. So my father, of course, went, and the policeman told him to go to the German guard told him to go to a certain section. I didn't know what to do, but as they were segregating other people, I saw a couple with children, and the German was busy because the men, they were going to separate the men and the children, and the woman started crying. When I saw that, I saw an opportunity to sneak into my father's section. I snuck in there where there was another selection. However, when I snuck in there, I realized that when the other selection, the Nazi officer is going to see me as a kid, is going to send me to the extermination camp. Luckily, there was a construction site nearby. I was able to take a cinder block and put it in the back road, stood up on top of the cinder block so the Nazi won't see that I'm a kid. So when he made the selection, he asked my father, what is your profession? He said, he's a mason. So he sent him to the able-bodied section. I could tell the difference. And when he sent him to the able-bodied section, he asked me, what are you doing? I said, I'm a mason's helper. So he also told me to go to the able-bodied section, but I couldn't step down while he's still watching. Right. So I had to wait till he went further away. Right. And I was able to sneak into my father's section. I was taken with my father because he said he was a Mason, they took him to a concentration camp, to a labor camp called Annaberg. Annaberg was a camp where we built camps, and we were there for 3 months, from which we were taken to Blechhammer, which is a larger concentration camp. There are about 4,800 prisoners in that camp, which was adjacent to a German industrial complex. And I was assigned to work for a welder, a German welder, who, by the way, had a limp and was injured on the Russian front. That's why he was not in the army. So he was pretty good to me. Very good, as a matter of fact. I was okay. But we were led from the concentration camp, labor camp, to the industrial complex in rows of 5, shackled and so on. And we were in different barracks. We were together, but he was in a different command group than I was, going to the industrial complex. We were led every morning and every night. We were given out rations. Now, because he was Orthodox, he tried to observe the laws of kashrut, of being kosher, and so on. So he didn't eat non-kosher meats and so on. As a matter of fact, I had a discussion with him. He says, Dad, look, I'm sure God is going to forgive you because under these circumstances you can abide by different rules. And we had discussions back and forth. I was very frustrated to be enclosed and see all that agony and all that punishment that people were given for little things, and people were starving if they were incapable of providing labor for the Germans. They were executed and sent into the crematorium. As a matter of fact, the barrack we were in were next to the crematorium. It was an awful situation. As a matter of fact, at one point, it was so bad, I said to my father, look, what's the point of me working my butt off for the Germans and then starve from agony? I may as well commit suicide.
Right.
So it was at that point my father said to me, look, you got to have hope. We got to have faith in God, that God will help you. I said to him, look, Dad, you talk about God. Here are the Germans, and the German soldiers of their buckle is their S insignia with the inscription, Gott ist mit uns, which means God is with us. You pray to God. How can God witness all this agony and let it happen? This and that. And I kept arguing with him. Lo and behold, he said to me, look, Sam, I'm going to tell you something. I'm going to tell you a story about 2 flies. They both fell into cream. One of them was a believer, but you don't want to be, you're not believing because you have a contentious relationship with God. So I'm going to tell you, one of them was an optimist, the other one was a pessimist. Those flies fell into cream. The pessimist had no faith in himself, had no values to hold on to, and drowned. He let go of his legs and everything, drowned. The optimist had a lot of hope and faith in himself, his ability. He didn't want to accept it. He started wiggling his feet back and forth and flapping the wings until he made butter out of the cream, got out. Let that be your lesson in life, he said. I want you to be hopeful. By the way, sure enough, a few months later, as we were walking. We were led from the industrial complex to the camp and so on in the snow. I noticed a woman walking on the side. At the beginning, I didn't know who it is. As we got closer, I realized she had the same coat as my mother. And I got closer yet, I realized it was my mother.
Oh, my.
And because we were shackled, I couldn't do anything. So I kind of nudged the guy next to me. I said, "Hey, this is my mother." He said to me, "Look, kid, shut up. Because if you keep your mouth open, they'll take her in." By the way, I was the youngest person in that concentration camp, you know, in that labor camp. So lo and behold, we got note that my mother left a note in my father's section with the contact information and so on. So we had a problem. The question is, how do we get in contact with my mother and so on? My father tried all sorts of ways to see if we can have a way of contact. And finally said to me, "You know what? Ask your boss." Because he was disenchanted after he was injured from the Russian front and so on. Maybe he will do it. Don't tell him it's your mother. Tell him you have an aunt someplace in the monastery, and would he go and visit her and so on. I did. I did, and he went. He was willing to do it. You see, while I really detest Germans and all this, they're good people in every nationality. You just got to find them. There were few and far in between, but I was fortunate enough to have that. So he brought back food and so on. I can tell you a million stories about things that transpired in camp, because despite the food that we got, that he brought from her, we lived under awful conditions. People were dying and so on. But my father came back to me and says, "You see, when you have hope, there's a light shining someplace. So it's a lot better than despair."
But during this time, Sam, during this time when you were questioning your father and you were questioning what was going on and all of this pain and suffering, did you ever lose faith in God?
It's not. I don't know if I would lose faith. I did, in a way. As I told you, I had a very contentious relationship with God. I was angry.
Yes.
I was angry. What did I do as a kid to deserve such punishment and such suffering? And I said to my father, "You say how righteous God is and so on." As a matter of fact, I brought it up to him. I said, "Look, at every Passover celebration at the Seder, you end the Seder with the sentence, L'Shana Ba B'Yerushalayim, which means, I hope we celebrate next year in Jerusalem. If you would have gone to the Holy Land before with my grandfather, we wouldn't have been through this and all that." So it's, you know, it's not a question that you're losing faith in God, but when you are under such punishing circumstances, you not only lose faith, you are embittered. And nobody likes to be embittered, but we're forced to be. In any case, by January of 1945, when we could hear the Russian artillery and everything, it was actually January 21st of 1945, the Germans decided to evacuate the ghetto, and take the prisoners deep into Germany, both to serve the German army, to dig trenches and so on. And they called it, that's in the annals of the history of the concentration camp, known as the Death March, because they led us from what every day without feeding us. All they asked us to take along is a blanket and the canister. And we hoped the reason they asked us to bring the canister, they would feed us. They didn't feed us. We had to go in the snow. I didn't tell you that when we were in the industrial complex, there were also prisoners of war from England, France, Russia, you name it. And as well as other civilians from European countries. We were forbidden to have contact with them. However, we did have contact. You didn't rather follow what you're forbidden to do. So I had contact with the French, so I managed to get a French sweater and French and leather shoes, because the concentration camp shoes had wooden soles on them, and when you walked on snow, it would collect like a ball of snow underneath it, and you could hardly walk, you would wobble. In any case, I had this. So when they took us out on the Death March on January 21st, things were awful. They would take us, and people were already emaciated, they couldn't walk, and they would overnight us in abandoned German barns, because the Germans ran away from the Russian onslaught, because they knew that they were cruel to the Russians, and the Russians would take revenge on them. And we were hopeful that things went bad. People were dying like flies. Things were so bad that I wouldn't even take the blanket that I had that I was told to bring along, because I knew that towards the evening I would be able to take the blanket from a corpse. You can imagine a 15-year-old kid having to go through all of that. It was awful. But lo and behold, after 3 days, as the Germans walked us, I saw a sign on an intersection saying Neustadt is 35 kilometers. In Neustadt was the town where my mother was. It was the address of the town where my mother was as a non-Jew in a Catholic monastery. So I said to my father, look, do you see this? Let us hide in the barn next time we are there. It didn't work out, because we were going to hide at the dusk of dawn,
Right.
While the roosters were crowing. The Germans got us out of the barn into this. Things went bad. Well, the 21st was a Sunday. Coming by Friday, it was the 26th, they take us out of the barn into an intersection out of the village. And as they took us out onto the intersection, of course, we were filling up our canisters with snow, because that was the only means of survival. We put snow into the canisters, melted on our belly so we could have something to drink, and so on. They halted us before at the intersection, because there were caravans of Germans running away from the Russian onslaught. There were convoys of German soldiers going back and forth. There was also a column of French prisoners of war. So they halted the concentration camp inmates. We had those stripes uniforms and so on. But that day had to have been anniversary of my grandfather's death. And it's a custom, a Jewish religious custom, to say in the anniversary of death, to say a memorial prayer. And this has to be done in the quorum of 10 men.
Mm-hmm.
But since the Germans stopped us, that enabled my father to go and say the memorial prayer. But at the same time, as he was saying the memorial prayer, I saw the German guard, Nazi guard, turning to a sled with his belongings and back to us. And I had no time. I just ripped off my striped cloth, and under which I had a French sweater and so on. And all I was able to do is poke my father on the shoulders. I said, "Dad, I'm going." And I left, hoping that they won't shoot me or that they won't notice it. And there was a bunch of German kids watching this, like you watch a menagerie or something. And so I said in German, I said, "Hey, you lousy Jew bastards," and so on. I went by. By that time, I suffered of dysentery. Mm-hmm. And so I went to a snowbank on the side of the intersection to relieve myself. I don't know what happened. I passed out. To this day, I don't remember what happened, but I remember that I came to myself. So when you say, if I believe in God, I believe that was an act of God.
Yes, sir.
God. But the way I want to tell you, that was not the only act. I've written a book about my experiences. It's called From Hell to the Promised Land. And anyone that wants to buy it, it's available on Amazon.
Sam, we'll make sure everyone knows about that. What an extraordinary story. So many things. I can sit here forever and listen to your stories. But it sounds to me like when you consider the two most important things that you felt about your life, it was your Uncle Moses who set you on that path, and it was your father who set you on that path to become the man you are today.
Look, I remember my father. It is painful to know that you lost a parent that fashion and that thing. So we went back from, I then joined all these Germans running away. A German woman would tell me would repeat verbatim the German propaganda, how the Jews are financing the war and all this. Finally, at the meantime, Russian planes were attacking the German military convoy. So when this was taking place, we had to disperse into the fields until the attack is over. It was just mayhem.
Do you have time? Let's take a few questions. We have people that are writing in some questions for you, okay?
Okay.
So Holocaust education is mandated in California. Yet because there are no educational standards, Holocaust education varies from school to school and district to district, with many Californian students graduating high school with little knowledge of the Holocaust. Do you think that Holocaust education is important, and why?
Holocaust, first of all education is important. And Holocaust education is important so the only thing, the only way we can improve our present judgment is by learning from past history.
Yes, sir.
And because this country is blessed by an assortment of people who seek liberty and the Statue of Liberty and the freedom that the great country of the United States has to offer. This is the greatest country in the world. And because we value freedom, we detest, and by the same token, hatred and anti-Semitism or discrimination of any kind. We were born equal under God, regardless whether we are black, white, blue, yellow, whatever.
Yes, sir.
And that's how I feel about life.
Terrific. Terrific. What you almost talked about some of the lessons that should be taught to our young people, and what do you think people hear today? Do people understand what you went through, and do they try to put it into their lives today?
To be honest with you, it's impossible for a person under the circumstances in the United States to understand the severity and the real cruelty of war and discrimination unless you personally went through it. It's very hard.
Yes.
But I was telling you about that potato that I shared with my father.
Yes.
You know, a person not going through anything like it would have a difficult time perceiving it even, that this would be a source of pride for a 90-year-old person of an event that happened 75 years ago.
75. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. It's hard to imagine. It's very hard to imagine. We have several people that have asked you questions related to God. So I asked you if you ever lost faith in God, but during your experience and the time in the camps, how did you keep your faith in God? How did you keep your hope up? And how did you keep going to the next day?
As I told you,
You started making butter.
it was my father who had an extraordinary, strong belief in God, who maintained my spirit and belief, because as I mentioned to you before, it wasn't just me. It was my father that imbued me with that faith. And the very fact that I was able to survive and that escape, it wasn't me that alone that did it. I was really led by a higher providence and able to do it.
The emotion and the feeling you must have had when you tapped your father on the shoulder and said, "Dad, I'm leaving," while he was saying Kaddish. I can't imagine.
what I didn't, we have limited time, so we cannot discuss a lot of things. But I had subsequent suffered enormous guilt feelings about why I didn't take my father with me. I want to tell you that I had previous occasions when I was leading my cousin and children, and we were caught, and I escaped while being loaded on a truck to Auschwitz with a cousin of mine. I was able to take him with me. But here I escaped without taking my father with me, and I know mentally that it was physically impossible for me to do it, because the risk to my life was enormous. But for me to take the responsibility of taking my father, me being the kid, the relationship equation doesn't quite work, but it didn't happen. And I knew mentally that it couldn't have happened, yet the agony and the pain that I had about me not having attempted to do it was enormous and has punished me almost all my life.
One of the next questions we have that I think most people would like to understand is, after your experiences, how did you come to learn to recover for those and start to enjoy life? Because even in the short time that I've gotten to know you, which has been a blessing on my life, you love life. I can tell. How were you able to come and transition from the horrid experiences that you had back in World War II to your love of life today?
For one thing, you can't live in the past. Any person, I don't care who it is, tries to kick himself in the rear for mistakes he made in the past, and all this is wasting a lot of time. As this goes for this as well as hate. If you spend the time hating, you just fail to enjoy life in its fullest. Life is really short.
Yes, sir.
And let me tell you, I might be 90 years old, but I try to enjoy life. Even in this pandemic, we here in Orange Country are blessed with a topography which is gorgeous. We have mountains. We can go. We have trails. And you can go and enjoy the wonders of the world. And if you are really limited in this pandemic, if your parents that watch it or whoever, I suggest you take your children for a walk in nature and enjoy God's wonder, how God created the world. You'll be surprised the closeness it gets you to your siblings, to your children, and the spiritual enjoyment that you get out of life.
Terrific. Today even, we still see an alarming rise of anti-Semitism in the world today, and we see hatred towards Jews, and we see all sorts of acts of evil. What has, in your mind, prevented mankind from learning the lessons of history so that we don't have to experience this any longer?
It basically stems from one thing and one thing only: ignorance. These people don't learn from history. They don't understand how much they are basically unhappy with themselves and project their bitterness onto others. It's like bullying in school, you know.
Yeah. No, that's very, very well said. Very well said. What your love of life keeps you going forward and keeps you moving forward. You've had children. You helped liberate the state of Israel, one of your two real things that you're so happy about and so thrilled about. When did you come to the United States?
I came to the United States in 1952. What happened was I escaped from the death march to my mother at the monastery.
Did you find her? Did you see her?
What?
Did you find your mother?
Well, let me explain to you. Let me tell you this. As I told you, we were marched. And I came, I didn't know that the Nised, which is the town where she was, is a river. When I escaped, and I came towards the town, and I saw this bridge, and there was a German sentry standing in the bridge, asking for
Papers?
legitimation
Yeah.
and papers.
Right.
I got scared. I was shaking in my breath. I said, what the hell am I going to do now? I said, look, let me see. I'll go there and face the situation. I had no choice. So he asked me, give me your papers, please. So I said to him in a broken German with a French accent, because I had French stuff on me, said, I don't have any of that. Could you? I said, look, I was working for a German peasant in German. And while the Russian planes were attacking the convoys, we dispersed in the fields. My peasant had all my papers, and we got lost. Now I come here to look for work. And I came there. So we were going back and forth. Finally, he said, get the hell out of here. So I did. And I went towards the monastery. Then you imagine the Jewish Orthodox kid going into a Catholic monastery and living after 2 years in a concentration camp. I go to the monastery. Everything was spick and span. And I just barely opened the door and see this beautiful banister. On the left, there was this huge cross of Christ and so on. I was afraid to expose my mom's identity and so on. My heart was beating like a drum. I go in, luckily the nuns were at prayer. I go in, stay behind the cross, my heart palpitating, and I see this woman walking down the stairs in a white uniform and so on with a tray. I didn't know. I wait, and I get impatient. Finally, the woman is coming back with a tray, cookies and everything and so on. So I say to her in German, excuse me, please. Do you know a certain woman by the name of Barbara Sigmund? That was her Aryan name. I didn't recognize her, that she's my mother in the white uniform. And I grew taller, so, there was a discrepancy there that I didn't quite know how to make out, and I was afraid. So she looks at me and she says, ja, ich bin das. Yeah, I am the one. Wer sind Sie denn eigentlich? Who are you, actually? She said, Mama, don't you recognize me? And she told me to go out, which I did. And she took me to another monastery where an aunt of mine was. It was an agrarian monastery where they had cows and so on. So she could put me in the summer residence And that's how we survived the war. And after the war, we hoped that other members of the family will survive. But out of a family of 108 total, only 5 people survived. Okay? So I joined in the communist occupation of Poland was totally discriminatory towards Jews, and anti-Semitism in Poland was horrendous. So we again, to survive, we engaged in black market stuff. So I met in Krakow a young guy who was, again, I was then not even 16 years old.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I met in Krakow a young guy who was in an orphanage which was run by the Zionist organization in Budapest, Hungary. Mm. And he told me how the goal is to go to Palestine, which exactly matched what I wanted to do.
Right.
So I told when I came back from Krakow to our town, I said to my mom, how about me joining it? We discussed it back and forth. She agreed to it, and she escorted me to the railroad station because I had a date with him to go to Budapest and join the orphanage. Mm-hmm. Well, as we got to the railroad station, his name was Lolek. We met, and he was going. The train was the conductor was already whistling for the train to move. My mom started crying. She says, "Don't leave me in all this." And it was a horrible moment, of separation. So, but the train was almost moving. So I said to her, "Look, Mom, maybe you could afford to lose a husband and 3 kids. I don't want it to happen to me, and I got to do something about it. And I'm going to. I love you." And I jumped on the train while it was moving. And we went to Budapest to an orphanage. Again, I could talk about the story for how long. It's in the book. If you want to know everything.
We'll plug the book. Don't. Sam, your courage is extraordinary, and people are asking questions, and they want to know what kept you from going crazy, what held you together.
I was crazy.
What thoughts pushed you forward. I think you're a little Meshuggah right now too, by the way. But what?
Hey, you don't know it. I want to tell you something. I'm hiking every day, right? I'm hiking every day. I'm going on the mountain, and I'm probably the only 90-year-old guy. You know what they call me up there?
No, sir.
Mr. PV. You know what it is? It stands for? You're full of piss and vinegar.
And that's what kept you going.
Yeah, you gotta take light and lively. Look, every problem is surpassable. Time will tell you. We have a pandemic. Believe me, you will forget about it.
Yes. Thank you. So I want to let everybody know, this is Sam's book here, From Hell to the Promised Land. It's on Amazon. It's $15. Sam, I hope that your book sales explode in the next couple of days or so with this. I could sit here all day, as you can imagine, listening to your incredible stories. And I know we had more questions from the people in the audience and from our viewers, but our time has come to an end. Thank you for helping us to keep the memories of the 6 million that were lost, men, women, and children, and we keep them in our hearts today, and we should keep them in our hearts and prayers every day. History is what we should pay attention to. History is what teaches us going forward what to avoid. Unfortunately, we don't listen to history.
You got to learn the lesson from history.
You have to learn the lessons from history. And so thank you to our viewers and the Jewish Federation of Family Services of Orange County for participating with the City of Mission Viejo to make this program possible. Stay safe, stay healthy, and be good to one another.
Thank you.
Thank you.